The morning sun cast long shadows across my farmyard as I walked toward the old red Massey Ferguson that had been my faithful companion for over 15 years. Something felt different today, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The air was crisp with that familiar smell of dew-soaked earth and diesel fuel that had become the perfume of my daily routine. I climbed into the tractor's worn seat, the leather cracked from years of honest work under the prairie sun. My hands found their familiar positions on the controls, muscle memory guiding every movement. The engine turned over with its usual reliable rumble, sending vibrations through the frame that I felt in my bones. As I began to back out of the shed, I pressed the brake pedal to slow my descent down the slight incline. Nothing happened. My foot went straight to the floor with no resistance whatsoever. Panic shot through my chest like ice water as the tractor continued rolling backward toward the fence line. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and killed the engine, using the emergency brake to bring the massive machine to a shuddering stop just inches from my neighbor's property line. My heart hammered against my ribs as I sat there, trying to process what had just happened. Someone had tampered with my brakes. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was deliberate sabotage. But who would do such a thing, and why? As I climbed down to inspect the damage, I noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth around my shed that definitely weren't mine. I knelt beside the tractor, my knees pressing into the damp soil as I examined the brake lines. What I found made my blood run cold. The main hydraulic line had been deliberately cut, not worn through or damaged by age, but sliced cleanly with what looked like a sharp knife or wire cutters. The cut was precise, almost surgical in its execution. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They had targeted the most critical safety system on my tractor, the one thing that could mean the difference between life and death when operating heavy machinery on the steep hills of my property. I stood up slowly, dusting off my hands and looking around the shed with new eyes. Everything else appeared untouched. My tools were in their proper places. Spare parts remained on their designated shelves, and the fuel can sat undisturbed in the corner. This wasn't random vandalism or theft. This was targeted, personal, and dangerous. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If I hadn't tested the brakes in the safety of my own yard, if I had discovered this problem while hauling a full load down the steep grade near Miller's Creek, I could have been seriously injured or killed. The weight of that realization settled on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. I pulled out my phone and snapped several photos of the damaged brake line, the footprints, and the surrounding area. Evidence. I would need evidence if I was going to get to the bottom of this. But first, I needed to figure out who had access to my property and why they would want to hurt me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through a mental catalogue of everyone who might have reason to sabotage my equipment. Sleep eluded me as I replayed recent conversations, business dealings, and neighborhood disputes that might have escalated beyond normal disagreements. There was Tom Henley, my neighbor to the east, who had been bitter about the property line dispute we'd had last spring. The surveyor had determined that the fence he'd built extended 3 feet onto my land, and he'd been forced to move it. He'd been civil about it, but I'd noticed a coldness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Then there was Marcus Webb, the contractor who'd been angry when I'd refused to sell him a 5-acre parcel for his equipment storage yard. He'd made several increasingly aggressive offers, each one accompanied by thinly veiled threats about what might happen to property values if certain businesses moved into the area. I also considered Jake Morrison, the young man I'd had to fire from seasonal work last harvest, after catching him stealing diesel fuel. He'd threatened to make me pay for ruining his reputation, but I'd assumed it was just angry words from a kid who'd been caught red-handed. The possibilities swirled in my mind like autumn leaves in a windstorm. Each suspect had motive, opportunity, and the knowledge of farming equipment necessary to know exactly how to disable my tractor in the most dangerous way possible. But suspicion wasn't proof, and I needed proof before I could take action. As dawn broke over the horizon, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to catch whoever was responsible, and I was going to do it with technology they'd never see coming. The next morning, I drove into town with a specific mission in mind. Peterson's Electronics had been serving our farming community for over 20 years, and old Pete knew more about surveillance equipment than anyone in 3 counties. The bell above his door chimed as I entered the cluttered shop, filled with everything from two-way radios to satellite equipment. Pete looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face creasing into a concerned frown when he saw my expression. I explained what had happened without going into too much detail about my suspicions. Within minutes, he was pulling boxes of small wireless cameras from his inventory, explaining their features with the enthusiasm of someone who truly loved his work. We settled on a system of 4 tiny cameras, each no bigger than a matchbox, with night vision capabilities and motion activation. They could record for days on a single battery charge and transmit footage directly to my smartphone. Pete showed me how to position them for maximum coverage while keeping them completely hidden from view. Back at the farm, I spent the afternoon strategically placing the cameras around my shed and equipment yard. One went inside an old coffee can on a shelf overlooking the tractor bay. Another found its place behind a loose board in the wall with a clear view of the entire work area. The third camera I positioned outside, camouflaged among the tools hanging on the exterior wall. The fourth camera I saved for a special location, hidden inside the engine compartment of an old truck I kept parked near the shed. Anyone approaching my equipment would have to pass within range of at least 2 cameras, and their faces would be clearly visible on the recordings. As I finished the installation, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Soon, I would know who was responsible for threatening my life and property. 3 days passed without incident. I went about my normal routine, repairing the brake line and maintaining the facade of business as usual while secretly monitoring the camera feeds on my phone. Every shadow, every movement in the distance made my pulse quicken, but the culprit remained elusive. I began to wonder if my saboteur had been scared off by the close call with the brakes, or if they were simply waiting for me to let my guard down. The uncertainty was almost worse than the original attack. At least then I'd known where I stood. Now I was living in a state of constant vigilance that was wearing me down, both physically and mentally. The cameras captured the usual array of farm life. Raccoons investigating my garbage cans, the neighbor's cat hunting mice in the equipment shed, and the occasional delivery truck turning around in my driveway. But no human faces appeared in the footage, no suspicious activity that would explain who had tried to hurt me. I found myself checking the feeds obsessively, my phone never far from reach as I went about my daily tasks. During meals, while watching television, even during conversations with friends, I was constantly aware of the small screen that might reveal the identity of my tormentor at any moment. On the 4th night, I almost gave up. Maybe I was wrong about this being a deliberate attack. Maybe the brake line had failed due to age or wear, and I was seeing conspiracy where none existed. But something deep in my gut told me to be patient, to trust my instincts, and to keep watching. My persistence was about to pay off in ways I never could have imagined. It was 2:47 a.m. when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera hidden in the old truck. I jolted awake, my heart already racing as I fumbled for the device in the darkness of my bedroom. The screen showed a figure moving stealthily through my equipment yard, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over their face. I held my breath as I watched the intruder approach my tractor. They moved with purpose, clearly familiar with the layout of my property. In their hand, I could see the glint of metal, A tool of some kind, probably the same instrument they'd used to cut my brake lines. The figure knelt beside the tractor, and I could see them working on something underneath the machine. My camera angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear they were tampering with my equipment again. This time, however, I was ready for them. As the person worked, they shifted positions slightly, and the infrared illumination from my camera caught their profile clearly for the first time. My blood turned to ice water in my veins as I recognized the face on my screen. It was Sarah Mitchell, the wife of my closest neighbor and someone I'd considered a friend for over a decade. Sarah, who brought me homemade pie every Christmas and had helped me search for my lost dog just 6 months ago. Sarah, whose children I'd taught to drive the tractor during harvest time and who had always seemed like the most trustworthy person in our small community. I sat in stunned silence, watching as she finished whatever sabotage she was performing, and slipped back into the shadows like a ghost. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have. This wasn't just an attack on my property, it was the destruction of trust, friendship, and everything I thought I knew about the people around me. But why? What could possibly motivate Sarah to try to hurt me? The next morning arrived grey and overcast, matching my mood perfectly as I prepared for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I had spent the remaining hours before dawn watching and re-watching the footage, making sure I hadn't misidentified the person on my security cameras. There was no doubt. Sarah Mitchell, my neighbor and friend, had been sabotaging my equipment. The question that burned in my mind was why, and I intended to get answers. I walked across the property line that separated our farms, my steps heavy with the weight of impending confrontation. The Mitchell farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel drive, lined with oak trees that had been planted by Sarah's grandfather decades ago. Under normal circumstances, it was a peaceful, welcoming sight. Today, it felt like approaching an enemy stronghold. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind her house when she saw me coming. Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked remarkably like fear. She knew. Somehow, she knew that I knew. "Morning, Sarah," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and neutral despite the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Oh, hello," she replied, her voice higher than usual as she fumbled with a clothespin. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" I stopped about 10 feet away from her, close enough to see the nervous tremor in her hands as she continued hanging sheets on the line. The morning air was thick with tension, and I could practically feel her anxiety radiating across the space between us. "We need to talk, Sarah. About my tractor." The clothespin fell from her fingers, landing silently in the grass at her feet. Sarah's face went pale as she slowly turned to face me fully. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of unspoken accusations hanging between us like a storm cloud ready to burst. Her shoulders sagged as if she was carrying an invisible burden too heavy to bear any longer. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. She couldn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on her hands as they twisted nervously in the fabric of her apron. I pulled out my phone and showed her the footage from the previous night. Her face crumpled as she watched herself sabotaging my equipment, and I saw something break inside her. The carefully maintained facade of normalcy shattered like glass, revealing the desperate, frightened woman beneath. "How long has this been going on, Sarah? How many times have you tried to hurt me?" She sank down onto the steps of her back porch, her head in her hands. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her cheeks, and I saw a mixture of relief and terror in her eyes. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was just supposed to slow you down, make you have equipment problems so you couldn't..." "Couldn't what?" I demanded, my patience wearing thin. Sarah took a shuddering breath before continuing. "Couldn't finish your harvest before the bank came to foreclose on our farm. We owe them everything, and they gave us until the end of the month. If we can't pay, we lose the land that's been in Robert's family for 4 generations." The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. The Mitchells were facing financial ruin, and they'd seen my successful operation as somehow connected to their own failure. Sarah's story poured out like water from a broken dam. Years of financial pressure and mounting desperation finally finding an outlet. She told me about the failed investments, the medical bills from Robert's heart attack, and the predatory loan terms that had trapped them in an impossible situation. "Robert doesn't know what I've been doing," she continued, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He thinks we're going to figure something out, find a way to save the farm through honest work and prayer. But I've seen the numbers, and there's no miracle coming." I listened in stunned silence as she explained her twisted logic. If my harvest was delayed by equipment problems, I wouldn't be able to fulfill my contracts on time. The penalties and delays would cost me money and reputation, potentially creating opportunities for the Mitchells to pick up some of my customers. It was a plan born of desperation and flawed thinking, but I could see how someone drowning in debt and fear might convince themselves it made sense. Sarah had never intended for me to be seriously injured. She'd targeted systems that would cause inconvenience and delay rather than immediate danger. "But the brakes, Sarah. That could have killed me." Her face went even paler. I thought you always tested them in the yard first. I've seen you do it 100 times. I never imagined you'd discover the problem while actually working." The revelation that she'd been watching my routine, studying my habits to plan her sabotage, sent a chill down my spine. This woman who I'd trusted implicitly had been observing me like a predator studying prey. But even as anger burned in my chest, I couldn't ignore the genuine anguish in her voice or the obvious remorse she felt for what she'd done. I stood there in Sarah's backyard, wrestling with emotions I'd never expected to face. Here was a woman who had tried to sabotage my livelihood and potentially endanger my life, yet I could see the desperation that had driven her to such extremes. The question that faced me now was what to do with this knowledge. The practical side of my mind said I should call the sheriff immediately. What Sarah had done was criminal, and there was no guarantee she wouldn't try again if I simply walked away. I had evidence, motive, and a confession. Any prosecutor would have an easy case. But the human side of my heart saw a neighbor who was drowning, someone who had made terrible choices but wasn't inherently evil. The Mitchells had been part of our community for generations. Their children went to school with my nephew, and Robert had helped me rebuild my barn after the tornado 3 years ago. "Sarah, I need you to understand something," I said finally, my voice heavy with the weight of decision. "What you did was wrong, and it could have gotten me killed. But I also understand that desperation can make people do things they never thought possible." She looked up at me with a mixture of hope and fear, clearly uncertain about where this conversation was heading. "I'm not going to call the police, but there are conditions. First, this stops now. No more sabotage, no more attempts to interfere with my operation. Second, you're going to help me figure out a way to solve your financial problems that doesn't involve hurting other people." Sarah nodded frantically, relief flooding her features. "Yes, anything. I'll do anything to make this right. Third, you're going to tell Robert everything. He deserves to know what's been happening, and you two need to face this crisis together." The relief in her eyes dimmed slightly at this last condition, but she nodded again. Over the next week, something remarkable happened. Once Robert learned the truth about their situation and Sarah's desperate actions, the family dynamic changed completely. Instead of Sarah carrying the burden of their financial crisis alone, the Mitchells began working as a team to find solutions. I found myself in the unexpected position of financial counselor and mediator, helping them understand their options and negotiate with creditors. My experience with farm economics and seasonal cash flow proved invaluable as we worked through their debt structure and identified opportunities for improvement. The first breakthrough came when we discovered that several of their creditors were willing to restructure payment terms if presented with a realistic business plan. Robert's pride had prevented him from asking for help earlier, but with Sarah's confession as a wake-up call, he was finally ready to swallow his ego and fight for his family's future. We spent long evenings around their kitchen table, surrounded by financial documents and farm records, working out the details of a recovery plan. I helped them identify assets they could sell to raise quick cash, crops they could plant for better margins, and equipment they could share with neighboring farms to reduce overhead costs. Sarah threw herself into the effort with the same intensity she'd previously devoted to sabotage. She contacted every creditor personally, explaining their situation and requesting modified payment terms. Her honesty and obvious commitment to making things right impressed even the most hardened collection agents. Gradually, a picture emerged of a farm that could be saved. It would require sacrifice, hard work, and several years of tight budgets, but the Mitchell family legacy could survive. More importantly, they would face the challenge together, with honesty and mutual support instead of secrets and desperation. 3 months later, I stood in the Mitchell's kitchen once again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The table that had once been covered with threatening notices and past due bills now held a celebration cake and fresh flowers from Sarah's garden. The bank had agreed to restructure their loan, giving them breathing room to implement the recovery plan we'd developed together. Robert's health had improved dramatically once the stress of impending foreclosure was removed, and he'd thrown himself back into farming with renewed vigor. Sarah had become a different person entirely. The desperate, secretive woman who had sabotaged my equipment was gone, replaced by someone who faced problems head-on with determination and integrity. She'd even started a small business selling preserves and baked goods at the farmer's market, contributing additional income to their recovery effort. "I still can't believe you didn't turn me into the police," Sarah said, as she cut slices of cake for everyone. "I don't think I would have been as forgiving if our situations were reversed." I considered her words carefully before responding. "Forgiveness isn't about what people deserve, Sarah. It's about what kind of person you choose to be when someone wrongs you. Besides, this worked out better for everyone than a jail sentence would have." Robert nodded in agreement. "What you did probably saved our marriage and our farm." Sarah was carrying so much guilt and fear that she couldn't think straight. Having everything out in the open gave us a chance to fight back. The conversation turned to plans for the upcoming planting season and the continued progress on their debt reduction. There were still challenges ahead, but they were manageable challenges that could be overcome with time and effort. As I prepared to leave, Sarah walked me to the door. "I know I can never completely make up for what I did, but I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for your kindness." A year has passed since I discovered Sarah Mitchell sabotaging my tractor, and I often reflect on the lessons that experience taught me. The most obvious lesson is about security. I've kept the surveillance cameras active and added a few more around my property. Trust is important, but verification is essential when your livelihood depends on your equipment. But the deeper lessons have been about human nature, community, and the power of both desperation and redemption. I learned that people I thought I knew completely could surprise me in both terrible and wonderful ways. Sarah's initial betrayal shocked me, but her determination to make amends and rebuild her life inspired me. The Mitchell farm not only survived but began to thrive again. They paid off their restructured loans ahead of schedule and even expanded their operations slightly. More importantly, their family relationships healed from the damage that secrets and financial stress had caused. Our community is stronger now too. The Mitchell's story, shared carefully and with their permission, has helped other struggling farmers understand that there are alternatives to desperate measures. The local Farm Bureau now sponsors financial counseling sessions, and neighbors are more willing to offer help before crises reach the breaking point. I still think about what might have happened if I hadn't installed those cameras, if Sarah had continued her sabotage until someone was seriously hurt. The thought serves as a reminder that small acts of vigilance and big acts of forgiveness can change the course of multiple lives. My relationship with the Mitchells has evolved into something deeper than simple neighborliness. We've been through a crisis together and come out stronger on the other side. Trust, once broken and then rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, proves to be stronger than trust that has never been tested. The cameras still watch over my equipment, but they're no longer needed to protect me from Sarah Mitchell. Sometimes the best security system is understanding your neighbors well enough to help them before they reach the point of desperation. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been a journey of betrayal, forgiveness, and ultimately redemption that changed all of our lives for the better. I'd love to hear from you. Please write in the comments below and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories from farm life. Your support means everything to content creators like me, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you who takes the time to listen and engage with these stories.